everybody, it's jrobi bringing you Game 8 of the World Chess Championships. Topalov's got the white pieces in this game. He's 1 point behind Anand. Of course, Anand is leading right now with 4 points, Topalov with 3 points, but he has just come off of 2 back-to-back draws playing the black pieces against Anand. Now, the reason he had to play 2 games with the black pieces back-to-back was because the last 6 games of the championship were reversed in playing order. So unfortunately for Topalov, he was under a lot of pressure over those last 2 games, because if he would have lost one of those 2 games, that would go down 2 points against one of the strongest chess players in the world, and that 2-point spread would be hard to achieve with only 4 or 5 games remaining, especially when you factor in that would only tie, let alone work towards a win. So nonetheless, definitely a momentum shift in Topalov's favor going into today's game. He's got the white pieces. Obviously, he's going to play for the win, but he's definitely not going to stretch too far, because if he stretches too far and creates too many weaknesses in his position, then he's going to end up losing. He definitely doesn't want to do that, because if he loses, it's all over. So definitely a lot of curious talk about what Topalov is going to play today. I'm anticipating an e4, knight f3. That's what I said in my last video. But Topalov basically played pawn to d4. And, there's 2 things that were learned about Topalov. Number 1, he's playing the same opening over and over and over again. I think that he's trying to feel Anand out, see what Anand's playing in those lines, and he's going to work towards improvement. That's probably one of the goals. Number 2, I think that this shows that Topalov's a stubborn guy, and he really believes in his ability in the d4 lines, and he just wants to prove it to the world that he can take Anand eventually. He hasn't had a lot of success so far, though, because he hasn't had a win with the white pieces against Anand since game number 1. But like I said, maybe he's just being a tiger there, crouched in the bushes, ready to pounce. All this time, kind of eyeing things up, checking what Anand's going to play in certain positions, getting a gauge on how their team is preparing for him. It's tough to say, but he's definitely not giving up on d4. And in fact, I'm just going to flip through the next couple moves, because it's very similar to what we've seen. In fact, there's no deviation in this game from previous games until I think move 13. So same concepts here. We're getting into Slav defense. Topalov is going to trap that bishop there onto g6, so the bishop's pretty much carved off from influencing anything. The only other square it can go to right now is h5, which once again doesn't, it doesn't accomplish anything at this point. From here, I'm just going to flip through the moves again, because we're just repeating the same position that we've seen in previous games. And now we get to our first deviation after Topalov captures a pawn here on c4, and Anand actually is the first person to mix it up in this game. He plays his rook over now to c8, so it's attacking that light square bishop. And once again, Topalov is playing down lines that Anand has looked at, because Anand obviously and his team have been studying these lines in great detail, considering we played a lot of them. So Anand figured that this would be an improvement in his position. So let's see how it panned out for him. From here, Topalov places his bishop now on b5, so it's pinning that knight down to the king. And Anand replies by pushing his pawn up to a6, so he's attacking that light square bishop, basically making Topalov make the decision right away as to what he wants to do with it. He can trade it off, or he can retreat it to another square. Topalov continues now, and he captures that knight on d7. Anand recaptures, and I think we should just take a quick pause here in the video and talk a little bit about something that happened in game 1. Anand's king is not safe. It's exposed. Of course, we also have the bishop sitting on f8, not accomplishing a great deal. The bishop there on g6 isn't accomplishing much, and the rook on h8 isn't accomplishing much. But we have to remember that Anand decided to go down these lines. So surely him and his team prepared for this possibility. So from here now, Topalov continues king up now to e2. Now this is connecting the rooks. Of course, we have the active bishop there on d4. We've got the knight on c3. And once again, I just want to draw your attention back to the black pieces that aren't contributing anything to the position. That's the bishop on g6, and of course the rook on h8. So at this point in time, Topalov's definitely enjoying the lead in development. From this position now, Anand pushes his pawn up to f6. So that's kind of blunting that the scope of the bishop sitting here on d4. Of course, that was attacking the pawn here on g7, but it's also opening up access for the light square bishop to possibly get into play by coming along this light square diagonal in this position. So a decent move from Anand in the position. From here, Topalov continues now rook over to d1, and of course this is threatening at some point to move that bishop off of d4 and hit the check there on the king sitting on d7. So to prevent that from happening, Anand tucks his king now onto e8, and Topalov continues now by pushing his pawn up to a5. So it's basically preventing the b pawn from coming down. It's also giving his bishop possible outpost there on b6 to carve towards the d8 diagonal. So good move from Topalov. Topalov in the position. Play continues now. Anand pushes his bishop up to e7. Topalov now continues by placing his bishop onto b6. So we have two attackers on the d8 square, but Anand doesn't worry about that. Of course, he's got the rook and the bishop protecting that square, and he swings his rook over now to f8. So he's basically saying to Topalov, I know you have a slight lead in development, but I'm going to ramp up my pieces. I'm going to put a whole lot of pressure on the f5 square, and I'm going to bring it to that square, and then I'm going to bust these pieces out. But of course, Topalov is going to try to prevent that from happening, so we'll have to see what happens as the moves progress. From here, Topalov brings his rook over now to c1, so he can move that knight now off of c3, potentially trade off a rook if it's advantageous to do so in the future. And Anand continues now by thrusting that pawn forward to f5, so he's attacking the pawn. Now, I just want to take a moment and stop here before, because I've had a couple questions asking me why I'm not using a lot of Ribka analysis in this series, and I want to focus on that for just a little bit here, because I think it's an important question, and I should probably address it. I know I talked a little bit about it in game one, but frankly speaking, I'm not too interested in looking at Ribka analysis in these games. I do take a look at some Ribka lines that people share to me or that they talk about going over the live coverage, but I generally don't get a lot of benefit from that. The main reason that I use computer engine analysis, and I'll give you my reason for using computer engine analysis, is to find mistakes that I make in my own personal games, to try to figure out where I went wrong. Of course, with obvious blunders, it's quite apparent where you went wrong, but to find positional mistakes that I might have made. Also, Ribka I find to be a great resource for opening move preparation, because the computer analysis will have the most played moves in the position up to a certain point. But I've kind of parted past with the whole Ribka that says that this will be a 0.3 better move for black or a 0.2 better move for black, therefore it's got to be awesome. And I've kind of got away from that and focusing more on trying to understand what the moves are and what the thinking behind the moves are when I'm going over these games. And I've seen actually an immediate improvement in my own play from doing that, and I'm hoping that that'll continue. Ribka is a very useful tool, of course. I definitely recommend that anybody who doesn't have Ribka, get a copy, or even Fritz, or even Crafty. Crafty's a free one, because it is a good benefit to have to go over your games, post-game analysis, of course, and try to find out where you made some positional mistakes. But I'm all about the plan now. I want to talk about plans and strategies as opposed to Ribka analysis lines. And there's a ton of information out there going over specific moves that Ribka offers up here during these games. But like I said, I'm not too interested in that. And in fact, Susan Polgar in her blog also talked a little bit about this. She's not too interested in posting a whole bunch of Ribka lines either. And she even touched on how in her paid training, and I think that you can actually purchase training from Susan Polgar, that's the way that she approaches her training too. And given that I'm trying to improve my chess and learn the game as best as I possibly can, that's definitely what the direction that I want to take. So anyway, I'm looking forward to your feedback and your comments on that, but let's get back to the game. So Anand wants to bust out these pieces that previously a few moves back just weren't accomplishing very much. So he pushes that pawn to f5. He's attacking the pawn on e4. What's Topalov going to do in this position? Well, Topalov elects just to push his e-pawn up now to e5. So he's basically saying to Anand, I don't want to have anything to do with opening up my kingside position, because I don't have any pieces over there. All of my pieces are on my queen side. They're carving down the files towards your king. So thanks for the offer, Anand, but no thanks. And of course, Anand wants to press into where he thinks he might have an advantage. So he continues to ramp up pressure now on Topalov's kingside. He brings his dark square bishop to g5. This is attacking the rook on c1, and Topalov replies by bringing his bishop back now to e3. So he's cutting off the scope of that dark square bishop. He's offering up a bishop trade in this position. Anand doesn't want to have anything to do with that, though. He wants to maintain his pieces on the board, and he also wants to try to press an advantage here on Topalov's kingside position. So he just pushes his pawn now to f4. Now, of course, this is attacking the dark square bishop. Now, Anand could retreat the dark square bishop right away, but Topalov has a really nice resource in this position, and it's by swinging his knight over now to e4. And this move is doing a whole bunch of things. First of all, of course, it's attacking the dark square bishop here on g5. It's also threatening to attack the d6 square, which would fork the rook and the king. But more importantly, it's also opening up access for his c rook to attack Anand's rook sitting here on c8. And Anand wouldn't be able to recapture because this king, of course, is tucked away and is not able to access the d file because of Topalov's rook here on d1. So it's an interesting move in the position. Anand opted to play rook takes first here on c1, but let's go back a move. Let's see what happens if he would have just taken the knight right off the table with his bishop. Well, it just leads to a huge mess for black because that rook is taken on c8, King has to retreat now to f7. Rook takes here on f8. Check again. King has to recapture, and now the dark square bishop can come out with check. And it's just a horrible position for black. So Anand definitely can't do anything like that. So he opts to just take the rook off of c1 first, from which Topalov replies now knight up to d6. So he's hitting that check, taking the knight off of the e4 square, because he doesn't want to have to recapture here with his f pawn, because then he'll have doubled up pawns on the e file. So he hits a check that gives him one more move to deal with the situation, and then peels the king off now to d7, and from here Topalov takes the rook on c1. So I thought it was a really nice continuation that Topalov decided to go for. From this position now, the king comes to c6, and Anand wants to get the king off of that d file, because of course the rook is sitting here on d1. Now this move is also threatening the king to come into the position to attack this weak pawn here on a5. So what Topalov plays is he plays his bishop up now to d2. That's defending the pawn, also keeping an attacker here on the f4 pawn, and from here now Anand brings his bishop back now to e7, so he's attacking the knight. And I want to take a little moment here and talk about the position as it currently stands, and it's focused around the f4 pawn. Now, of course, Anand does not want to drop a pawn in the position. Right now the material is equal, but his light square bishop sitting here on g6 is preventing this g-pawn from thrusting forward here to g5 to give this pawn a defender. So by having the dark square bishop sitting here, Topalov's constantly eyeballing this pawn up, which is marrying down this rook to protect that pawn, because Anand definitely doesn't want to drop a pawn in the position. So I thought that was worthwhile to mention. So from this position now, Topalov hits a check now, brings his rook over to c1, hitting that check. King goes back now to d7, and Topalov now relieves the pressure here on the f4 pawn, but he's also preparing to bring his rook over to d1. So a little bit of a give and take there. From here now, Anand captures that knight. Topalov does not recapture right away, though. He simply slides his rook over to d1. So of course that's pinning that bishop down to the king, and there's nothing that Anand has in the position that's going to allow him to get another defender here on the d6 square. So this bishop is going to fall. It's just a matter of time. So from here, Anand continues now bishop to f5. So he's preparing to thrust that g-pawn forward to give this pawn a defender before this dark square diagonal can start attacking it again. And Topalov prevents that and pushes his pawn up to a4. So he's basically saying to Anand, if you want to get a defender on that pawn, you're going to have to play with both of your pawns. You're not just going to be able to just push your g-pawn forward and be done with it. From here now, Anand continues pawn to g6. Topalov continues by taking that bishop now, so he's taken a little bit of time to recapture, but now he has it, hitting the check. King goes over to c8, and from here now Topalov brings his bishop back to d2, once again attacking that weak pawn on f4. So I thought that this play from Topalov to really centralize his pressure here on f4 and work towards keeping this pawn weak was really interesting, and I really enjoyed looking at that as I went over the game. From here now, and then brings his rook over to d8. He's offering up a rook trade. Topalov does not accept that, though, and he just captures the pawn now on f4, and then takes the rook. Topalov recaptures, but he doesn't have to worry about this pawn being taken now, because this dark square bishop is defending it, and there's absolutely nothing Anand has in the position that's going to change that. He can't just bring this pawn down because the bishop will snag it up, and it's going to take a long time to get this king over to support any kind of pawn push here. So Topalov really exploited that weak pawn on f4, and he was able to recapture the rook after the rook came off here on d6, and now he has a strong protected passed pawn. So from this position, Anand continues king up to d7, bringing his king closer to that pawn. Topalov doesn't worry about that, though. He just brings his own king up, and now we have a bishop versus bishop. And just take a look at all of the pieces here that Anand cannot attack with his light square bishop. Now the same can be said about Topalov's position. Like, Topalov has a dark square bishop, and virtually all of Anand's pawns are currently on light squares. But the difference is that Topalov has that passed pawn on the d file, and he's got it protected with the bishop. So he has a big plus in this position. So Topalov can definitely play for the win. From here, Anand brings his bishop to c2, and Topalov brings his king closer to the action, placing the king on d4. Of course, Anand cannot control these dark square diagonals anymore. He's just got a light square bishop now. So Topalov's king can penetrate into this position. So Anand's got to be very careful about that. Anand brings his king to e8, potentially thinking about blocking this king from getting any closer to his pawns. And from here, Topalov continues now king to e5, so that king getting even closer. Anand continues king to f7, so of course this is stopping this king from penetrating to the f6 square, and from here Topalov continues playing his bishop now to e3. Anand continues bishop to a4, so we got some bishops moving around. Now Topalov brings his king to f4, so he's going to try to get his king along these dark squares. Anand plays bishop up now to b5. There's not really a lot that this bishop can do, by the way, so it's just kind of moving around at this point. It might be able to come down in here to f1 to attack this weak pawn, but if that were to happen, of course Topalov could just push the pawn up, so it's not really a big threat for Topalov. So Topalov continues now bishop up to c5, giving that pawn a defender again, just in case while he's working towards getting towards this side of the board, Anand might try to swing his king back and attack that pawn. From here, Anand pushes his king up now to f6. Now this is putting his king on a square that can be checked, and Topalov doesn't ignore that. He hits a check, kicking that king back again, and from here Topalov brings his king up now to g5. So really good endgame play here from Topalov to get his king closer to the position where it can influence the position and start attacking these pawns. So Anand's going to have to worry about that, and of course Anand has to worry about that past d pawn. Now as the position currently stands with his bishop sitting on b5, that pawn can't be pushed without support from the king. But Anand also has to worry about his pawns on the h and g file. He doesn't want that white king to come in and munch those up, because then you got three pawns waiting to collide and crash into the position and promote. So definitely very dangerous position here for Anand. So Anand continues now bishop up to c6. So of course this is attacking along these this light square diagonal towards these pawns. That means that this pawn can't be pushed on the f file. It also means that the g pawn can't be pushed right away. So Topalov continues now by playing his king up to h6. So his king is even closer to Anand's pawns. Now Anand has to worry about the protection of the h7 pawn. So he's pretty much forced to play king to g8 now to defend that. And Topalov continues by pushing his pawn up to h4, attacking that pawn now on g6. Now from here, Anand swings his bishop to e8. So he's attacking along this light square diagonal. So if Topalov were to capture the pawn, he could recapture, and Topalov wouldn't be able to do anything about that pawn on that light square. And Topalov plays a really interesting move in this position. He says, okay, you can have the pawn on h5. I'm going to play my king to g5, which is going to give me the option to play my king up to f6. Anand has to worry about that, but Anand plays his king up to f7 first. So that takes away this penetration point here on f6. From here now, Topalov plays his king again to h6, and Anand does play his king back now to g8. Topalov doesn't want to repeat the position and draw though, so he plays his bishop up now to c5. So he's defending the pawn again and basically getting a move in the position. Now from this point, since the king isn't threatening penetrating here on f6, Anand goes ahead and captures that pawn now on h5. Topalov can't recapture, but he's not worried about this pawn because he's got this pawn along the g file that can capture that pawn if it ever comes down. So from here he plays his king back now to g5. So once again threatening to get on the f6 square, and then plays his king to g7 to prevent that. And from here Topalov hits the check. King peels over to f7 now, and now Topalov brings his bishop to e5. So he's maintaining control of this dark square diagonal here. And then plays now pawn up to h4. Topalov recaptures, and then brings his king now to g6. So he's creating basically an impenetrable shield here on the f through h files. From here Topalov continues king over now to g4, and then plays bishop back now to b5. So once again, if this pawn is pushed, this bishop can capture. From here now Topalov places his king onto f4. So once again on a dark square, and Anand replies by bringing his king back up to f7, and Topalov plays his king up now to g5. So basically Anand cannot get back to the g6 square to create that impenetrable wall, from f5 all the way to h5. From this position, Anand brings his bishop to c6. So once again, still protecting the d7 square, also carving along this light square diagonal on these pawns so that they can't move in the position. And Topalov continues by playing king up now to h6. From here, Anand plays king to g8. Of course, he has to defend that h pawn. But from this position, I want you to pause the video and see if you can find the next move for white. I want you to look for a move that completely busts black's position, because there is a move in this position that does so. So go ahead and pause the video, take as long as you want to, and then come back. I'm going to dive right into what was played here. But from this position, Topalov thrusts his g pawn to g4, and Anand resigns. And we're going to talk a little bit about some possibilities here moving from this point on. But Anand is completely busted in this position. For example, if he tried to continue on, say by playing bishop to e8 to maintain control of this light square diagonal, also to continue to protect the d7 square, Topalov is just going to slowly get his pieces working together to isolate Anand's king from preventing Topalov's king from accessing the position. For example, here this king's going to march all the way to d8, and it's pretty much game over. And that was pretty much the only try Anand would have had. For example, if we go back here to the pawn push to g4, if he would have came in and just captured the weak pawn on f3, well, Topalov just pushes his pawn up to d7. We're going to get a queen on the table, and it's going to be game over right away anyway. So just a horrible position for Anand when Topalov pushes his pawn up to g4. So Topalov really took it to Anand in this game. I really enjoyed the play, especially when he made use of that weak pawn on f4. The rook trade was advantageous for him, giving him that passed d pawn. And we have a chess match now. Both players are tied 4 apiece. There's only 4 games left. Both players have 2 cracks at the white pieces. It's anybody's game at this point. But for the last 3 games, there's been a huge momentum shift in Topalov's favor. So he's definitely got the momentum going into the last 4 games. But you know what? It's still anybody's game. We're talking about Anand, current world chess champion, but I think that Topalov the Tiger is in good form and in good shape for the next few games. And both players are only 2.5 points away from securing the world chess championship. So it's definitely going to be an interesting match moving forward. And I'm glad for that because that's good for chess fans everywhere. So take care. Hope you enjoy the video, and we'll see you next time.